All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and Ethan for today's presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Hey, thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start, I guess, with introductions. So my name is Ethan Fenner. I'm the horticulturist for the Southern African collection at the University of California Botanical Garden here in Berkeley. I also take care of the cycad and palm collection, but today we're talking about our trip to Namaqualand.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Doran. I'm the Director of Collections. I oversee horticulture and curation here at the UC Botanical Garden. Very pleased to be talking with you about some of the wonderful sights we saw in Namaqualand. A few questions, a few things that we accomplished there. Without further ado,
Yeah,
take it away.
we'll get started. So first, what is Namaqualand? Namaqualand is the northwest slice of South Africa. And depending on what book you're reading and when it was made, there will be different boundaries to what people consider Namaqualand. But generally, it's the Atlantic Ocean on the west, the Bokeveld Plateau and Bushmanland to the east, getting up into higher elevation areas. The southern border is usually called the Olifants River. That's the Elephants River. And then it goes north into Namibia and the Namib Desert with the Richtersveld areas. This area has very low rainfall, and the rainfall pattern is primarily in winter. There's going to be a few summer storms, but it's primarily winter, and a lot of it is just sort of a coastal fog that the plants attract. The flora type is called succulent Karoo, and it took me a little bit to get my mind around it. We are not in the Karoo. There's place names called the Karoo. This is the flora type that is called succulent Karoo in Namaqualand. There's upwards of 3,000 species of plant, and half of those plants are endemic to the region of Namaqualand, so a high degree of endemism. And there's four main divisions. There's the Neersvlakte, which are the quartz fields around Van Rhijnsdorp. This is that sort of yellow area here. There's the klipkoppies, which are the sort of the rocky hills. And that's this orange bit here, sort of higher elevation kind of mountainous areas. There's the Sandveld or the coastal areas, which are obviously along the coast here. And then there's the driest area called the Richtersveld, which is this bit at the top here. This image was actually a big poster in one of our guest houses in Springbok, which is the largest city in Namaqualand. And it was really cool to see the floral type sort of represented. And here's a general rainfall map. I know this isn't the clearest, but you kind of get a sense of the amount of rainfall that we're talking about here. We're looking at Namaqualand sort of right around here. Down here is Cape Town, where we started. You see that this gets a decent amount of rain. That's going to be primarily winter rainfall, almost exclusively winter rainfall. The further east you get in the country, the more you're going to get summer rainfall as opposed to winter rainfall. And you can tell that all these blues and greens, it's getting much more rainfall through here. As we go north, the rainfall gets lower and lower as you are approaching the equator, approaching the Namib Desert. And you can see up here in the Richtersveld, or maybe you can't see, but I can see, it's less than 100 millimeters as the mean annual rainfall. That's just about 4 inches. And you can see orange is not much larger than that. So some of the frequently asked questions, some that I've been answering a lot. Did we collect anything? No, we did not. Only memories and photographs and that kind of thing. A lot of these ecosystems were very fragile, and we did not want to collect things sort of willy-nilly, especially without any permits. Who did we go with? We went with a tour called Palanzii Tours, and the head of that tour group is Carol DeToy, who is a former captain of police of the Springbok area and knows more about the Namaqualand than just about anyone else. We were joined with Adam Harrower of Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden down in Cape Town, as well as Stephen Brack, who founded Mesa Gardens in New Mexico. And the three of these guys were real experts. Between the three of them, we were not searching for plant names. They knew them right off the bat. Stephen Brack especially is an expert in the meson group, the Isoaceae family. We were also joined with Tim Gregory and Andrew from UCBG, as well as our dear friends Gideon Dollarhide and Marcus Tamura of the East Bay Regional Parks. Yeah, so what did we do all day? It was a 10-day trip, and every day we had breakfast at 8. We got on the backies by 9. Backies are the pickup trucks. And then we just went around and drove around and got to specific sites to look at some cool plants. And that's basically it. And then we had dinner. How many pictures did you take? Around 1,700. And this was all with my iPhone. And this is just my pictures, by the way. And so we had to make some real hard sacrifices, choosing things to be present in our slideshow. But we think we got some highlights.
So we sort of did a pre-visit to Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden. Part of my agenda really was to get to meet our colleagues at the Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden, do a sort of behind-the-scenes tour, and get acquainted with the flora a little bit, and to see some of the challenges they face and what we might be seeing in the field. Also, we wanted to establish a relationship with them, with the UC Botanical Garden, with Kirstenbosch Botanical Garden, for a plant exchange, seed exchange between the two institutions. We were also shown behind the scenes where a theme of this talk you'll see in several places that many of the plants have been poached or show signs of poaching in the habitat that they occupy. And unfortunately, then when these are confiscated by people like Carol DeToit, they are transferred to the Kirstenbosch Botanic Garden, where they're in a sort of a strange limbo, pending reintroduction back into the field. And this is just a small sampling. Conophytum calculus that you can see in the center will be shown in all its glory later on in the presentation. This is gives you an idea of the scale of poaching. Off to the left, you can see Buophony, Hymanthoides, and Clivia mirabilis off to the right. It's constant, and these are only the examples of things of plants that have been seized, let alone what ends up in the illegal plant trade. So we started at Melkbos Strand, which is across from Cape Town. You can see Table Mountain over the dunes there, and Cape Town just below the Table Mountain. And this was basically our sort of kickoff part of the trip. We first went to somewhere relatively close by. You can follow us on the little map on the bottom left of the screen most of the time. This was almost like a sort of a super bloom wildflower meadow, TNE Versfeld Nature Reserve, where we started to get sort of cut our teeth on things that we hadn't seen in nature before, starting with some pretty spectacular Babianas, Babiana rubrocyania and Geyseriza radiums, although different genera, seem to be mimicking each other, perhaps to attract the same pollinators in this case. Geyseriza aspera and Geyseri monanthus were also in this meadow. And our first introduction mine to Morea, other in nature, and also our first Gladiolus elatus.
Which is blooming now in the collection, if you want to
Okay,
see it. Yeah.
all right, sorry. Yeah, well, please chime in if something's in flower now. The sort of dominant plant of this, and really quite weedy, but very, very pretty, was Wachendorfia paniculata, and also off to our right here, Peridia capensis. There were two different species of Drosera in a small wetland in this area. One which was not typical of the Droseras I'm familiar with. Drosera cistiflora had an erect habit with linear leaves, as opposed to one I'm more familiar with, which was Drosera pauciflora, which has sort of the basal rosette of spoon-shaped spatulate leaves and these wonderful pink flowers. So both in flower at the same time, both growing right next to each other, are a real treat. Also, our first geranium family, genus Monsonius speciosa. More Geraniaceae and Asphodelaceae and Asparagaceae. So Pelargonium, Triste, the first of a number of pelargoniums that you're going to see in this talk. Bulbonilla, Triquetra, and Asphodelaceae, and our first Laconalia pallida in Asparagaceae. Also, in the cabbage family, Heliophila, Africana, and in the scroffs, Nemesia barbata, which many of you are familiar with in cultivation.
There's these are annual plants also, and I wanted to mention that Nemesia looks like the photo is upside down. That's because the photo is upside down. I took the photo of the plants looking the other way, and then I realized barbata, that means beard. The plants are reversed, and so that is the beard of Nemesia barbata.
So after leaving this, which was fairly easy botanizing compared to what was to follow, we headed into Namaqualand proper, and we started to get some wonderful scenery that you can see in this image.
Yeah, so this is one of the first sort of iconic Namaqualand species, Monolaria moniliformis. I've heard this called the bunny ear succulent. It makes these two leaves, which are pretty long, pretty succulent, and they're deciduous. So they drop off in the dormant season when things get really hot. You can see these swollen internodes are characteristic of this plant, sort of on the picture on the right. And that's an indication of how old the plant is. Yeah, towards the end of the day, getting into Van Reinsdorp, took a quick couple of photos of a lot of cool things in bloom. This oxalis on the left was changing its color to go dormant, kind of like its sort of quote unquote fall foliage. And I thought that was just remarkable. Cotula was an annual daisy that was present in a lot of different environments, just kind of a loose mat all across the field. And then our first Ferraria, variabilis, with this nice orangey color to the outside.
Wonderful, and also coming into flower soon in the garden.
Yep.
So we then drove to Ganabos Quiver Tree Forest, and I made the comparison to Joshua Tree National Park, which the South Africans found very offensive. And so I withdrew that statement, realizing it was quite different, but it had a sort of similar look and feel. And so here, the landscape is dominated by these aloidendron dichotomans in the Asphodelaceae, and they're quite ancient specimens. I'm not referring to Carl or Tim Gregory, but the specimen behind them would be hundreds of years old. What was really delightful to see in the field was a lot of information exchange with South African botanists and Ethan. One of the purposes that we were there was to gain real habitat experience of aspects and soil types, all which you can really only do when you're in the field experiencing and sharing information. So this picture on the right is Adam Harrow from Kirstenbosch and Ethan discussing flowerhead. We were also introduced at this site to Codon royenii in the Boraginaceae, the borage family. And you can pull off the flower and suck on the base of the corolla, and you'll get this very sweet liquid, which we all sample, providing you avoid the spines. Our first Apocynaceae, Hoodia gordenii, I believe it was slightly malodorous. Yeah. Yes, slightly malodorous, and really, really striking looking member of the Apocynaceae. Here's Gideon from East Bay Regional Parks posing with that, and another one of our co-presenter, Ethan, here with aloidendron, somewhat larger than our specimen in the garden here.
Yes.
So this area had been fenced off to prevent people from driving right up to it or driving amongst it because it's quite a fragile habitat. And there's various um, um, anti-poaching or do not dig things up here. Our sponsor for the trip, Tim Gregory, actually installed a fence to prevent people driving up to it and also to prevent more poaching going on. Seems to be quite successful. We also encountered our first conophytum. So a lot of the time on this trip, we were spent on our hands and knees looking at a very, very small plant indeed. And sometimes actually, oblivious to our surroundings because we had some real conophytophiles with us. So this is the first of several conophytums. Conophytum Luckdorfii, Azoaceae. Wonderful picture as well. It was here actually just that we encountered one of the most remarkable toilets in South Africa because it had an acacia karoo ceiling. So someone had gone to enormous lengths to harvest the spines and spiny stems off an acacia, a native acacia, which is incredibly armed. This is a tire puncturing acacia. So it was quite a remarkable achievement. On our way further into Namaqualand, we stopped at this waterfall. Ethan snapped a picture of a plant known to us here in California for being a terribly noxious weed, Oxalis pescapri. And actually in habitat, it's moderately well behaved. And here when it likes California quite a bit more, it occupies large swaths of our gardens and native habitat.
Yeah, so while we were up in the Namaqualand area, we went to Hantum National Botanical Garden, which is a large expanse somewhere between a garden proper like we have and kind of a preserve. Just fields of annuals and all of these cool dolerite copies sticking out. Here's those sort of reddish dolerite copies among some of the grasses. Yeah, they almost look like they were stacked intentionally. On the right, you can see a lot of the foliage of a Brunsvigia species. Not sure which Brunsvigia species this is, but these are one of those bulbs that they put out these very flat leaves. They photosynthesize in the growing season, and then the leaves disappear and the flowers come up. So you can imagine each one of these bulb heads would be a candelabra flower coming out of the landscape. It must be amazing to see in summertime. Lacertia frutescens was a very widespread plant. I saw this down in Cape Town where I was previous to the trip, and then pretty much all the way up through Namaqualand, pretty far north. This one, though, was a special treat to see. Was in full bloom, blooming in these rocks, kind of sprawling around. My guess is it was very well fertilized by rock hyrax droppings. And that's why it's bloomed so beautifully. In and around Tantum, there were some very cool iridaceae plants. One, the Babiana vangilii, and this cool little yellow. That's an early bloomer for us in the collection. Bromulea cellulosa, which was the most impressive bromulea that we saw. They always seem to be a little bit chewed up on the side by some insect or another. And then Laperosia jacquinii, which is just iridescent. It has these like many of these bright flowers, sort of different layers to their epidermal cells of the flowers, and yeah, it kind of makes it a little sparkly, which is cool to see. Yeah, and then back to Van Reinsdorp, sort of down the mountain pass. That's sort of looking back towards the east of the sort of plateau that we climbed to get to Hannibus, and Newitville and Hantum Botanical Garden. So the next day we went to the Neersvlakte, and the Neersvlakte, as I mentioned, is typified by these white quartz fields. And the quartz itself is pretty cool to the touch, even on the hotter days. yeah, you would be burning up, and then you touch some of these quartz, and it would still be quite cool. One thing I've heard is the Neresblakta was referencing the sound that the wagon wheels made as it was traversing through this area.
Grinding plains.
Grinding plains, yeah.
So this is on that sort of a quartz pavement, and we were really quite flabbergasted at the plant diversity that was represented in literally a square meter. So I took this video of Adam Harrower commenting on different species. So the sound quality is a little bit on the faint side. It strengthens as the video plays, but it's unfortunately got some commentary by me as well.
So what is absolutely incredible is the amount of species that we've got in just this one square meter of quartz. Adam, can you point a few out? Right. Here. Adromiscus. Another one. Adromiscus. There we go. Hemisphericis. We have numerous succulent daisies as well, like Senecio. I'm not sure of the species, perhaps it's bulbinifolius. And then one over here, which is Senecio sulci calyx, which is quite widespread in the Namaqualand West. And crash, which is absolutely my favorite. Premier pulchro modernata. Premier pulchro. Tylocolon reticulatus. And so because crashula herpes, you see here the bushes with the hairs, I think this is a super crashula herpes. And look at the bulbini there. Oh yeah, that's there's a dwarf bulbini species. In fact, we don't know the name of this thing. Species, maybe. So there we.
So there were an incredible diversity of plants there. I think that we had a sort of mini crassular bioblitz when we were there. Like, it was either 12 or 20 different 12 different species in a sort of an area pretty much what the size that you're looking at. So really quite remarkable.
Yeah, and one of those species is Agrioderma delightii. Agrioderma is, it means silver skin, referring to its epidermal cells. And it is a genus that is endemic to the Neresblakta. I didn't want to step on any, but it was difficult not to. They're pretty tough though. They're very succulent, very firm. Let's see if I can get this. Crassula deceptor, that was one that Adam was referencing in the video. Deceptor means that it is deceiving. It is trying to blend in with the rocks and the sort of the sharp quartz. But when it's in the full sun, it turns on this nice rosy color, which was really nice to see. There's about 34 other genera in the Crassulaceae family besides Crassula, and that's about 1,400 species. And just in the genus Crassula, there's about 200 species. So we've got several on our tour, but this one was one of my favorites. Goniella variegata. It was cool to see these colors sort of popping out of the landscape. Really cool foliage and really healthy clump. This seemed like so much healthier in habitat than I've seen it in cultivation in a lot of situations. And then Conophytum calculus. This was probably the largest Conophytum that we saw, but still very, very small. You could think of this as no larger than a quarter. And often you would see these in different, with multiple heads to them. This one was a single-headed individual, a little pillow sitting on the rocks. And what we're looking at here are two fused leaves, and the meristem is sort of sunk in between those leaves. So this was a favorite species of mine. Albuca concordiana in the Asparagaceae family. Not flowering, but beautiful to see its leaves. And we saw a few different plants that had this spiral pattern to it. We saw this albuca, several other albucas. We saw Gephalus in the Amaryllidaceae family. We saw Morea, Pritzeliana in the Iridaceae family. And that implies that this is independent convergent evolution to this spiral pattern. And all of these are bulbs. And so why does it have this spiral pattern? It's designed to capture and funnel the light amount of rainwater to the plant's roots. And also in the spiral pattern, it keeps it a little bit more protected from desiccation in the harsh winds. So Euphorbia hamada. Euphorbia is a gigantic family, or Euphorbia itself is a gigantic genus that's very diverse and widespread. It's the same as poinsettia. And so looking at this hamada, you see some of the leaves that are changing to a reddish color. And in many cases, these leaves are almost vestigial. They'll kind of become deciduous and fall off. And the main sort of photosynthetic unit of this plant is the stems. And here you can see it with some of its fruits on it as well. Chrysanthemum shortlandicum, just fields of these beautiful pink cushions. In Afrikaans, these are Vites. I can't do the G. There's Carl in the background to give you a sense of the scope. It was just stunning, the expanse of these Chrysanthemum. And a related species is this Chrysanthemum ludoritzi. Chrysanthemum, the name means dew flower, and it refers to these epidermal cells that are storing water. And that serves a couple of purposes. One, it prevents desiccation, to store some water as succulent leaves. The other thing is having these water cells right on the surface, it refracts the direct sunlight so that the plants themselves, the photosynthetic cells, don't get too burned. And really cool to take photos of these with the light in the background. It really captures the sort of the epithermal cells of some of these plants. Crassula columnaris was a very interesting species. This one in particular is monocarpic, which means that after it flowers, the whole plant dies. So it lives for a while, almost camouflaged directly with the rocks, and then it sends out this spike. This again is a very small plant, even though it might look a little bit larger on the picture on the left. But once it flowers, it sets its seed and the plant itself dies. Pelargonium incrustatum in the Geraniaceae family. This was what we called roadkill stops, where we're driving along the road and someone sees something that we want to see, or we want to just stop by the side of the road for a few minutes while we're driving somewhere else. And so glad that we did, because these guys were in full bloom all around these mountains right beside the road. So we climbed up and snapped a few pictures. These are tuberous pelargoniums. They die back to a storage unit that's underground, and then they come back fresh in the early spring. So the next day we were in the Springbok clip copy area. If this looks familiar, these sort of rock formations form the basis of the Southern African sort of Karoo area redo in 2001. So if you're coming to the garden and you are trying to experience the super bloom, notice how the placement of the rocks, which was expertly done, was trying to mimic some of these sort of clip copy areas of Springbok and sort of the surrounds. The first stop was this Colpius mollis, which is in the Scroculariaceae family. It found the coolest niche kind of growing in these rock crevices. And often it wasn't, it was kind of almost on the underside of the rock, almost like upside down. The cool thing about this plant is the flowers face out so that it can get pollinated. But then after pollination occurs, the flower stalk, which is forming the fruit and the seed inside, they reflex back to the rock. and then they distribute their seeds that way so that its progeny can also find a suitable habitat in one of these crevices. Yeah, very cool to see. So Hyobranchi rubra, we saw a couple of different Hyobranchi, and this is in the Orbranch family. These are fully parasitic. So no leaves whatsoever. It only forms flowers above the ground that come directly out of the soil. And then somewhere underground, it has roots that are tapped in to other roots. It seemed to be pretty generalist as far as what roots it was tapping into. One of the common names of this plant is cat's claws, because it kind of looks like, claws coming out of your cat's paws. And the Orbranch family is same as some of the other parasitic genera that we might be familiar with, like beach drops that I remember from the East Coast and broom rapes from out here. So here's Crassula deltoidea. And crassulas have a lot of drought adaptations. And one for this plant is the sort of glaucousness, this white powder that forms on the tops of the leaves and on the new growth especially, trying to limit the direct impact of the sun. Also, these plants have a different type of photosynthesis called crassulacean acid metabolism. The main takeaway is that the stomata, the things that collect air, are only open at the nighttime. And then in the daytime, when it's hot out, they can keep those stomata closed. Mawsonia bifolia was a cool bulb to see. These were already turning over and the flowers were mostly done. Fruits were forming. This is interesting because it's one of the only bulbs that we know of that is pollinated by rodents. And so the flowers themselves have a nutty smell, sort of, and the rodents come over and get into that and then pollinate the plant. Larilegia cactiformis, another really cool stapeliid that's in the Apocynaceae family. Not a cactus, not a euphorbia, but a milkweed. And then Pelargonium primorsum, or angel's wings, was a shrubby type of pelargonium that was towards the top of some of these copies here. Pretty reduced leaves and some of the stems on the outside made it a little thorny, a little spiky. Chirodopsis ambrosia. This was Stephen's favorite to see. This was a long hike this day up to the top of this mountain, and it was worth it to see these guys in flower amongst these rocks here. Right, so the next day on the 11th, we went from Springbok, sort of west towards the coast, towards an area called Kleinzee. And this was some of the sort of the copy kind of areas as well. In this photo, we have a couple different columnar euphorbias. So over here is Euphorbia dregiana. I believe this is Euphorbia ephedroides. Both of these plants had been living in our arid house for a very long time. Following this trip, I decided I wanted to plant them out. There's such a cool sort of visual break to the landscape with most of this sort of shrubby, sort of low growth. Yeah, I thought they were beautiful. We saw two different stapeliads here growing almost right next to each other. And so the one on the right is Orbea namaquensis, with this sort of elongated sort of circle to it. The one on the left is called Tromotriche pedunculata, and Tromotriche means trembling hairs. You can see those black hairs sort of on the corolla and on the corona, sort of they rustle in the wind a little bit. These are designed to attract fly pollination who believe that these plants are carrion, like dead rotting meat, on which to lay their eggs. And so they have a pretty foul smell as well. These were cool to see also because they were usually in the shade, the light shade, right against another shrub. The foliage was pretty dark, but once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. This was one of the smallest crassulas that we saw, Crassula susanii. Yeah, not more than a few millimeters above the soil. This whole clump here was probably about the size of my hand. To me, it reminded me of like the surface of brain coral or something, kind of this reticulated maze on the surface of the earth. Next day, we went to Kleinzee proper, yep, there's the coast in the background and all of these beautiful flowering low shrubs and annuals and succulents in the foreground. This was my absolute favorite Lachenalia, Lachenalia anguinea, or the snake skin or snakehead Lachenalia. It had these beautiful kind of multicolored flowers as they sort of developed. And then the leaf itself and the stem were just this beautiful kind of mottled red and kind of a yellowish. Really cool. And of course, the iconic Buophony hymenthoides. I've heard this, people, some say bouffon, some say Buophony. Buophony sounds a little fancier, and that's what we heard people say most in South Africa. These are the iconic bulbs, which we have in our collection as well. They take a long time to get to a flowering size, but they can live for hundreds of years. And some of the ones that we saw here were massive enough that we thought that they were probably over 100 years old. These are bulb plants, and so the leaves die back and the flowers come out without the leaves in the summertime. Some of the bulbs were massive. Unfortunately, this is a site that was recently poached, and you can see someone's taken a photo of me holding a husk looking sad. That was evidence of poaching. Poachers came in, they dug up the bulbs, they cut this husk that forms on the outside of the bulb, which is actually providing some insulation during the heat. And then they discard the husks and pack away the Buophony for sale somewhere else. So that was sad to see, but fortunate that we were able to see so many beautiful, healthy old specimens. Jordanella spongiosa, another very showy mesum. This plant had thick finger-like leaves and one of the showiest in the genus, I would say. Near the coast, you would get into these sort of quartzite rocks, these little outcroppings here, and you would often see a few little succulents kind of growing together and helping each other out here. So the small one, sort of closest, is the Conophytum minutum in the Azoaceae family. And then the one behind it is an aster, Curio crassifolius, sorry. Yeah, that used to be Senecio. Yeah. Pelargonium fulgidum, which we have blooming in the collection. This is the parent of all the other red pelargoniums that are in cultivation here. And you can see it often kind of popping out of rocks, but super happy, super floriferous. We saw a few different pelargonium sort of right next to each other in this area by the coast. Oops. Yeah, so Gazania splendidissima. Yeah, even further to the coast and growing in deep sands, had this nice mound to it. And believe it or not, this plant was not officially described to science until 2011. It looks similar to some of the gazanias, at least the flower does, to the ones that we have cultivated in California, as well as the ones that are out in South Africa. But this one is special. It's a narrow endemic to the coast here, south of Port Nolloth. Yeah, very cool. So Oxalis conferratoranii is what we're calling this. This was one of my absolute favorite plants. Very small. These are, sand grains that you can see in full focus. Have these beautiful sort of dusty reddish blush on the outside of the petals. It is possible that this is a brand new species that has not yet been described. And Fenestraria, this is another sort of one of the Namaqualand must-see. One of the common names is baby toes, I guess because they are wrinkled and stick out of the sand like baby toes. Yeah, so in cultivation, you'll often see these sort of sticking out of the ground a little bit more. But in habitat, they were very close to being right at the surface of the sands, and many of the sort of leaf heads were fully submerged underneath the sands. Some of that's a product of the amount of water that it received and the seasonal time. But I've got this little diagram here to sort of illustrate how Fenestraria and some of these other dwarf Azoaceans work. Fenestra is the Latin word for window. And so these are little window plants. The top of the surface of the leaf does not really photosynthesize. It's mostly water cells. And so the sunlight hits that, it bounces around, sort of refracting within these water cells. And then the photosynthetic cells are kind of a narrow band on the interior of the leaf, sort of going down below the surface. And that's designed to keep the plant cool, keep the meristems protected. Yeah, so that's Fenestraria. And then it was back to our accommodations. This is the guest house that we were staying at called Daihuathoop, named for a big ring of mesem wood that was created here. And this gives it, it was a very quirky, quaint little place. Yeah, accommodations were very comfortable, a little sparse, but the food was great. It was all sort of communal food that was cooked, and we ate it by the fire, and really nice place to stay. So on the 13th, we went sort of north from Klein Z area, and on this day we went kind of inland back to the clip copies. And then we also sort of wound up by the coast in and around Port Nola. One of the plants that we saw here was Ropura cordifolia, yeah. And the leaves looked like many of the other succulent kind of glaucous leaves that we had seen elsewhere and that were sort of very present in this area as well. But the flowers were very different. So this is in the Zygophyllaceae family, which creosote bush is one of the other plants that we might be familiar with in that family. Chirodopsis robusta was an especially colorful plant. Yeah, you can tell that this plant is already sort of headed towards its dormant time, and you can tell that because the leaves themselves are a little bit wrinkled, and the plant is showing a lot of accessory pigmentation, you would say. And so generally for Chirodopsis, the outer leaves will shrivel up and form a little sheath, and then the inner leaves will kind of meet and then kind of sink into that sheath a little bit. Eriospermum paradoxicum. This might be the weirdest plant that we show today. The word of the day is innation. And so an innation is a leaf outgrowth that forms. They look like these little conifers or something like that. And that's not even a leaf. The leaf is down here at the base, and then from the leaf comes this innation, which is photosynthetic, but it doesn't have vascular tissue in the sort of outer bits of it. So that's Eriospermum, a bulb in the Asparagiaceae family. James Bertinia maxii in the Scroculariaceae family. This plant was surprisingly large, could be up to 1 meter tall, and we saw some that were pretty tall. Yeah, very nice fresh flowers on this James Bertinii. And often you'd see it sort of in crevices or, well, sort of local canyons besides some larger rocks. Crassula alstonii was one of my favorite crassulas. Classic drought adaptation kind of form to it. with these overlapping leaves and highly reduced surface area. Selectoranthus stylosus, we saw a large amount of these plants at the top of one of the hills that we climbed. The coolest thing about these plants are these cages that they make around their fresh leaves. Yeah, these are thorns. They're branches that stick out and then branch further off from that. You can kind of tell on some of the red thorns that there are some leaves that are present at the nodes where the thorns sort of branch. But they'll be red in the growing season when the branches are coming out, and then those bits of the stem will die back, and it will be this sort of this gray stems that you see there. That's last year's growth or the year before. Of course, they're protected from predation. Quaqua mammillaris, another stapeliid in the Posinaceae family. These had relatively smaller flowers compared to some of the other stapeliids that we saw. But it formed these giant follicules. That's how you know it's in the milkweed family. Always in pairs and quite large, sticking out. Quaqua is an indigenous Khoi word that was used for these plants. I'm very partial to oxalis, whether they are in flower or not. And this oxalis magnifolia was changing, going dormant, probably already flowered well earlier in the season. Now it's preparing to senesce and go back to its bulb under the rock. But I just love the subtlety of these colors as it was changing, kind of blending in a little bit with its surroundings. Yeah, Crassula tomentosa was a very widespread plant. Tomentosa refers to the hairiness all over the leaves. We saw these in leaf and in flower. Bulbini mesembryanthioides subspecies Namaquensis in the Asphodelaceae family. These were super cool. Some of you might be familiar with bulbinellas or bulbinis that grow, and many of them have sort of strap leaves or something like that. They come out, they look a little bit like aloes or nymphopias or something like that. Mesembryanthioides species, the leaves are reduced so that they almost look like little caterpillars, kind of sleeping on the base there. Yeah, and so that's referring to its mimicry or its look to mesums, some of the little succulents that we saw. And of course, that's a drought adaptation. So Euphorbia capitmedusae, our guide still called this Euphorbia confluens, but confluens now is grouped within the capitmedusae sort of group. Very widespread plant as it's currently described, all the way from the very south point of Cape Point, south of Cape Town, pretty far up into the north of Namaqualand. Wallenbergia and grata in the Campanulaceae or bellflower family. Yeah, made all these beautiful blue loose mats. This is another annual, in stark contrast to these red sands. So this is the Wallenbergia and grata sort of field, and this sand is called Kalahari sand. And it's a very coarse sand that's rich in iron oxide. Yeah, it was really cool to see. People refer to some of these plants as Dr. Seuss plants, but this was a whole, Dr. Seuss landscape of red ground and blue plants. And then amongst the Wallenbergia were some really nice succulents. The light was coming down, so it was really fun to photograph. Here's a Carnicosia elongata. And then Claritum bellitiforme with beautiful bright pink. This one used to be Dorothianthus. And you can tell that it's getting quite late in the day, casting the shadows from such a small plant. And then the sunset as we returned back to Port Nolith and had our dinner. So the next day, we are going to the fourth and final area of Namaqualand, the Richtersveld. And this is a proper desert area, and right on the border with Namaqualand. With Namibia. One of the plants that we saw in one of these canyons was Anacampstros filamentosa. Makes these hairs, probably the hairiest plant we'll see today. These hairs act to refract ultraviolet radiation as it's hitting the plant. It also collects the scant amount of water that is present, comes in as fog. On the left, we have Carl, our guide, who's having a pensive moment in one of the canyons that we were climbing around. And I climbed to the bottom of this canyon and saw this beautiful Hornia, Namaquensis, also a stapeliid in the Apocynaceae family. Grillum humifusum, in a kind of obscure family, Neuridaceae. The Afrikaans common name for this plant is pietsnot, which means snotty peat. And you might be asking, how does a plant have snot without a nose? There's a lot of mucilage that forms in the cut surfaces of the stems and in the roots, which is can be a food source. About 90% of the plants that we saw were this pale yellow with white centers, but 10% had this beautiful sort of pink color to the interior. I thought that was great. So an annual in the Neuridaceae family. In the Richtersveld proper, we saw Monsonia Pattersonii, another Geraniaceae family plant. And here it is in flower and in its leaf. So the leaves are pretty small and folded. They do sort of become deciduous, and then you're left with these spines that protect this very sort of thickened stem, where it will wait in dormancy until it receives some amount of rainfall again. Laperosia Berkeley, which was a really cool plant to see. These were pretty widespread throughout this area, and just immaculate blooms despite the harsh conditions. These, unfortunately, are becoming endangered. Tylochodon schaeferianus, a relative of the larger Tylochodons that we saw in the copies, such as Tylochodon paniculatus, but these were super, super small. Our colleague Marcus called these the magic bean plants. Strumeria bidentata. This is in the Amaryllidaceae family. It's another bulb, and the same with Boaphony and Amaryllis that we're so familiar with. It made these two little leaves that stick almost vertically up. I have no idea how it survives. The sand here was really whipping. You can see that a lot of the sand has attached to the plant. Yeah, so somehow it survives its little heart shape in such a harsh environment. This was the coolest pelargonium that we saw. Pelargonium subthorpianum in the Geraniaceae family, right on the surface of the soil. This plant has a large underground tuber, but we were so fortunate to see these plants in peak bloom. So I'm probably laying down on the soil to take this photo. And then you can see it's how oppressed it is to the soil. And it's really fuzzy, really succulent leaves. Ferraria schaeferi, we had to make a lot of harsh decisions with including Ferrarias in our talk, but this one we absolutely had to include. It's an interesting plant that's only found in the north of Namaqualand. Dregiocloa primula, the Tom Thumb grass. I know this is not the most exciting species that we will see on our talk today, but it is interesting. This is the only grass that is known to be a true succulent. So you can see how sort of thick those leaves are. Very unusual for a grass to have that kind of form. Yeah, and so here we are. This was a little mountain that I climbed. There's looking down at our caravan of the Bakis. Now, if you look here, there's a little bit of water. That's the Orange River. And then behind it is Namibia. And so Namibia, South Africa. We did not go into Namibia. We just turned around and went back. Back to Port Nulliff. And then the next day we start the head back. And so go from Port Nulliff all the way down to Ben Reinsdorp and stop a few places on the way. First place that we stopped was this pretty tall mountain that we drove up and then parked. All of these trails that we were going on were four-wheel drive required in a lot of instances. Many of the paths that we were on were dirt roads. Here's Mitrophyllum discitum with its sort of old leaves that are turning, and then Gideon slipped at a 50 to show how dexterous this plant is. Mitrophyllum refers to the mitre, bishop's mitre, the hat. And just an alpine gardener's dream. Totally natural rock crevices here with just a treasure trove of cool succulents and bulbs and things to see. This is why it took so long for us to get anywhere. It's because we were poring over these rocks and taking pictures of cool things that we hadn't seen before, cool forms of plants that we had seen. One of the plants that was especially cool, Microloma calcianum. We saw this throughout Namaqualand, but we included it here. This is a vine. It's pretty slender vine, and the flowers are quite small but very bright. And so, despite being in the Apocynaceae family, it's apparently palatable to livestock, which will sometimes eat it all the way down. Chirodopsis peculiaris, called peculiaris because it's not like any other Chirodopsis. These were the most beautiful Chirodopsis that we saw. When the flowers are closed, it had this kind of strawberry ice cream look to it. And then by the time we were sort of done at the site, many of the flowers had opened up. One of the common names for this plant is Essolor, which is the donkey ears, referring to these big leaves, purple leaves at the base of the plant. This plant is extremely endangered and limited to about 10 square miles. And so love it and leave it, as Carl would say. Happy to see this plant before it is poached out of its habitat and no longer present on the earth. So September 16th was our fast return to the Cape. And I'll go faster here because I know that we're coming to our time. And this was itself a mad dash from Van Reinsdorp so that Andrew could catch his flight back to London. So Oophytum nanum, bright red, very small, but sticking out of this quartz and remarkable to see. Oophytum means egg leaf. Agrioderma subalbum in the Azoaceae family. You can see a few old capsules, and that's what you would use to ID the plants within this family, or the structure of these capsules. And being that it's in Agrioderma, you know that we are back in the Naresblokta areas with all this quartz. Morea serpentina. Most of the Morea serpentinas are white with yellow, but this one had this beautiful lavender color to it. And that photo on the right is our friend Marcus in the background. And then Diplosoma leucophii, which I would call the most edible plant. I really wanted to taste it because it looks like candy. Diplosoma was one of the smallest plants that we saw. These are pebbles, not boulders. And when they go dormant, they lose their leaves and they're just like right on the surface. What we're seeing here are the old flowers that come up above it. And there was a whole forest, quote unquote, of Diplosoma leucophii. It was really cool to see.
So thank you, Ethan, for that marathon. And then you might be thinking, well, did you come across any critters during your travels? And the answer is very much yes. The first video on the left is what we call a sun spider in the order Solifugi. If I press play, you'll see how far, oh, excuse me. You'll see how fast this, it's not gonna. There he is, he's on the other side, he's right there now. There he is.
You know what that is? That's the Solifugi. This is the sun spider. They are unbelievably fast moving.
Unbelievably fast. Oh, I know, there he is on the other side.
They're other species on Earth. They are
Look at him.
utterly horrific. It's a sort of
It's a spider person's worst nightmare, isn't it? There he goes towards you. So there was the Solifugid, and it is got quite an interesting appearance. A scorpion that we literally came across here. We're still working on IDs, although iNaturalist is providing quite a few of those. And a whole, he's on the other side, he's right there. And a whole menagerie of crickets, of millipedes. Tim was there for the tortoises. The camouflage of some of the crickets was absolutely remarkable. On our right there, we have a horned adder just lying, sunning itself, and its camouflage was completely remarkable. You can see on some of its scales are white colored, so it's blending into sort of the pieces of quartz in the sand there almost perfectly. So the next talk is to be continued. What role do we play in all of this? What role does UCBG play in plant conservation in Southern Africa? We intend to do a botany lunch at the Herbaria to try and attempt to answer some of these questions and to discuss a strategy. On that front, here's our team here. Thank you, and thank you for Tim, who's kneeling with the hat. Tim sort of sponsored a number of us to have this opportunity. If you're interested in sponsoring these sort of activities, I'd like to remind you that today is the big give for the Botanic Garden. So please, your gift to the garden will support conservation activities such as this.